Thank you so much, Pilar. I'm excited to be here. So we're going to cover four things. So the history of LLMs, how they got so powerful, why they behave the way they do, and why your context is so important when interacting with them. So before we can talk about large language models, we need to talk about like what is a language model. So a language model is a text-based algorithm that uses data it's been trained on to predict the next word in a sequence. So it's not a new concept. They've been around since the 1950s. So for example, if I say my favorite color is, a language model will predict blue more often than it will predict the word house. That sounds like common sense, but the important thing to know is that when like a language model doesn't know that like my favorite color is house, doesn't make logical sense. All it knows is that based on its training data, there are significantly more examples of my favorite color is blue than there are of my favorite color is house. So the models aren't truly like thinking, they're mimicking thinking. So that is why AI can be like wrong. So it's just making very educated guesses based on patterns. So that's generally the very important part on like why it can hallucinate and things like that. Okay, so now let's talk about how language models got so powerful and became large language models. So we're going to go back to 2017. Google introduced a new architecture. It's called the transformer. It was basically a really big breakthrough because it allowed us to analyze text in a very kind of like new and innovative way. So basically, you could process very large sequences of text at once rather than one step at a time. So as you can imagine, really big deal. It essentially kind of opened the door to all of the modern day kind of models that we have now. The T in ChatGPT stands for transformer. Okay, so now let's talk about why models behave the way they do. So I think there's three big reasons I want to get through here. So number one is the data it's trained on. So when you type into ChatGPT, the text goes through a process called tokenization. So essentially, the text is broken down into what are called tokens. So tokens are the unit of data and measurement that LLMs work with. So tokens are like roughly like words. They're not exactly the same, but close enough. So how many tokens are we talking about here when we're talking about like training data? So ChatGPT 3, the kind of big one that kicked off the AI boom, was trained on 500 billion tokens. Okay, so for context, all of like the English language in Wikipedia is about 5 billion tokens. Okay, so that's the first one. But then ChatGPT 4 was trained on 13 trillion tokens. Okay, so we're not just talking about like, oh, it's lots of data. No, it's like exponential increase in like just a few years. So that's why the models are getting so good so quickly because they're trained on so much data. Okay, so that's part one on how they behave the way they do. The next piece of the puzzle is called a parameter. So to very much oversimplify this, you can think of a parameter in the LLM as like a settings and little dials that affect the output. So the key here is that there aren't just like a few parameters for each model. There are literally like billions of them and sometimes trillions. Okay, so that's part two. Part three is the prompts. Okay, so there's really kind of two main prompts that you've probably heard of. So there's system prompts and user prompts. So for system prompts, you can kind of think of these as the instructions for the model. So these are set by the creator of the model. So OpenAI, Anthropic, they create their own, system prompts. So what you probably don't realize is that when you are, typing into these tools, what you're putting in is actually getting inserted into a system prompt. So that model has been that model has kind of been created with. So that's kind of how that works. So that's the third piece on kind of why models kind of behave the way they do. So I said there are kind of two types of prompts, right? So there's system prompts and user prompts. So the user prompt is what you put in. So this is why you hear the terms prompt engineering, context engineering like everywhere, because essentially models just have access to a large amount of data. So you can kind of think of a huge library. But the key thing is that it doesn't know exactly what you want. It doesn't know what you need. It doesn't know like what your constraints are. So that's why you need to give it as much context as possible, because when you don't, it's just going to make a very educated guess. Remember, it cannot read your mind. So what are some best practices when you're giving it more context? So these are things you've probably heard of, like give it a role. So like what persona should AI act as? The task, kind of what do you want it to complete? Details, things like specific requirements or constraints, and the format. So like what do you want the output to look like? How do you want the tone of voice, or all those kind of things can go into your context. Okay, so key takeaways. I'll leave you with one big key takeaway is that the more context you provide, the better your results will be.